The scorching sun beat down over the endless plains of Texas. Dust swirled along the dirt road leading into the small frontier town of Red Creek, a place where law was often more of a suggestion than a rule. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to the strange mix of gunmen, traders, and wanderers who passed through, but today something unusual was about to unfold. James Harland, a rugged rancher with broad shoulders and sun-leathered skin, rode his horse toward the town with a purposeful stride. His reputation had preceded him, a man who could tame wild horses, chase rustlers, and negotiate deals others would hesitate to touch. But today it wasn't cattle or money that occupied his mind. It was a deal that weighed heavily on his conscience. Across town, in the dim interior of the Red Creek Saloon, sat Clara Winslow, her brown hair tied back and eyes wary of the bustling activity around her. She was known in town, not for wealth or status, but for her perseverance. The small debts she had racked up were now catching up to her. She had borrowed money from men who didn't forgive easily, and now the time had come for repayment or something far worse. James dismounted outside the saloon, his spurs jingling. The air seemed thick, heavy with tension. Inside, Clara's eyes met his, a mixture of relief and fear crossing her face. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the piano's melancholy tune. "I said I'd handle it," James replied, his deep voice steady. "But you need to understand, once we make this deal, there's no turning back." The other men in the saloon, the ones she owed money to, noticed the exchange. A few muttered threats, but James's presence was enough to silence them. He had the sort of confidence that made men think twice before acting recklessly. The agreement was simple yet harsh. Clara had defaulted on her debts to a dangerous creditor, and James had stepped in to pay the sum in full. But the terms weren't about generosity. They were about obligation. "You paid for me," Clara said quietly, almost in disbelief. "Now, you do it." James nodded grimly. "I will, but I do it my way." The days that followed were tense. James escorted Clara across the plains, guiding her through treacherous landscapes where rustlers and wild animals lurked. Along the journey, he began to see more than a debtor. He saw a woman who was strong, clever, and resilient in ways that surprised him. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on his chest, but also an unexpected connection forming. At night, around the campfire, Clara would tell stories of her past, of her struggles and the dreams she had been forced to abandon. James listened, sharing fragments of his own life. Tales of growing up on a rough ranch, learning to fight, and surviving losses that had hardened him. Slowly, trust grew between them, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, as the stars shimmered over the prairie, Clara finally voiced the thought that had been lingering in her mind. "Why are you helping me, James? You don't owe me anything." James's gaze was steady. "Sometimes a man does what needs doing, and sometimes he sees something in another person worth protecting. That's all there is to it." The journey wasn't without danger. One afternoon, a group of bandits ambushed them near a narrow canyon. James's quick thinking and sharpshooting saved them both, but it also revealed his depth of care. He fought not just out of duty, but because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. By the time the dust settled, Clara realized she could rely on him not just for protection, but as someone who understood her in a way few others could. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the creditor's compound. Clara's debt was settled in full thanks to James's payment. Yet as the men accepted the money and left, the tension between them remained. Clara understood now the unspoken expectation. The deal had been paid for, but it had come at a cost, a bond formed in circumstances neither of them could easily undo. As they rode back toward Red Creek, the silence between them was heavy, charged with unspoken words and possibilities. The journey had changed them both, revealing hidden strengths, vulnerabilities, and perhaps the beginnings of something deeper. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, Clara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She owed him her freedom, her life even, but at what personal cost? And James, watching the horizon, knew that this was just the beginning. The deal had been made, the debt settled, but the story of what came after was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Creek as James Harland returned Clara to the town proper. The streets, usually quiet at this hour, were now alive with murmurs. Word of James's intervention had spread faster than wildfire. The townsfolk, ever hungry for gossip, whispered in corners and doorways. Clara walked beside James, her steps hesitant but steady. She felt the weight of both gratitude and unease pressing on her chest. Every eye in town seemed to follow her, every whisper a reminder that her life had shifted in ways she barely understood. "You think they'll leave me alone now?" she asked softly, her voice strained. "They might," James replied, eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. "Or they might just wait for another chance. People like them don't forgive easily." Despite the unease, there was a strange sense of relief. Clara no longer owed a debt she could never have paid herself. And yet she knew that what James had done was more than money. It was a commitment that bound her in ways she couldn't articulate. James led her to the small ranch he had inherited from his father. It was modest by some standards, but vast compared to the cramped townhomes. Horses grazed lazily in the fields, and the scent of hay and leather filled the air. For the first time in months, Clara felt a flicker of safety. Inside the ranch house, Clara could not help but notice the signs of James's solitary life tools meticulously arranged, a worn leather chair by the fireplace, and a rifle mounted above the mantel. Everything spoke of a man accustomed to independence, to relying on himself alone. Yet here he was, choosing to protect someone else at great personal cost. "Stay as long as you need," James said, breaking her reverie. "The town won't touch you here. And if they try—" He trailed off, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of ranch life began to settle around them. Clara learned to ride, tend to the livestock, and even handle a rifle with James's guidance. She was not a stranger to hard work, but the experience gave her a sense of purpose and an unexpected closeness with James. Yet life in Red Creek was never without its complications. Rumors of their growing companionship reached ears they hadn't intended. Some whispered that Clara was now James's property. Others speculated on what such a bond might mean for the future. Clara felt the sting of judgment, but James remained a steadfast presence, quietly offering protection and counsel. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara finally confronted the question that had been simmering in her mind. "James, why me? Out of all the people in town, why risk so much for me?" James looked at her, eyes reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. "Because you needed help, and I knew no one else would do it the right way. And maybe because I see something in you worth more than gold or debt." Clara's heart skipped, caught between gratitude, fear, and a fluttering warmth she couldn't name. She realized that James's actions were not just those of a protector, but of a man who had chosen to invest his time, his risk, and perhaps his heart in her. But the past has a way of following, no matter how far one runs. One night a shadow moved across the ranch's fence line. James, ever vigilant, noticed it immediately. Rustlers had returned, testing the boundaries, testing the man who had dared to stand against them. The confrontation was swift but tense. James's experience and skill ensured they survived without harm, but Clara could see the toll it took on him. He was a man who lived constantly on the edge, yet now, there was more at stake than just cattle or pride. There was a woman he had chosen to protect, and that choice made every danger sharper, every decision heavier. The incident solidified something between them. A bond forged not only by necessity but by mutual respect and unspoken affection. Clara realized she had begun to rely on James in ways that went beyond gratitude. She trusted him, perhaps more than anyone in her life, and James for the first time felt a protective instinct that went beyond duty. But as the town's whispers grew louder, and as both of them struggled with the societal expectations of Red Creek, one truth became clear. The rancher had made a choice, and that choice would not just affect the present. It would shape the future, in ways neither of them could yet fully understand. Spring arrived in Red Creek with a promise of renewal, yet life on the Harlan ranch remained anything but predictable. Clara and James had grown closer, their bond deepened by shared hardships and quiet moments of understanding. The townsfolk began to notice subtle changes, how James's gaze lingered on Clara, how she carried herself with a confidence born of hard-earned independence. One afternoon, as they worked in the fields, a traveling preacher arrived in town, bringing with him the possibility of a formal union, a wedding. James had never considered marriage. His life had been a series of responsibilities and survival, never romance. But Clara, standing beside him under the wide-open sky, represented a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. "You know," Clara said, pausing to brush sweat from her brow, "maybe it's time. We've faced enough to know life's too short to wait." James hesitated, the weight of his past and his instincts pressing on him. But looking at Clara, the woman who had survived, adapted and trusted him despite everything, he realized that some choices were meant to be seized. The wedding was small, held in the modest church at the edge of town. Few townsfolk attended, but those who did were witnesses to a bond that had been forged in fire and trust. Clara, radiant yet grounded, walked down the aisle with the calm determination of someone who had fought for every step she took. James, tall and rugged, looked at her with a mixture of pride, love, and a promise of protection. The vows were exchanged, simple yet profound, marking not just a legal union but the culmination of shared trials, mutual respect, and undeniable affection. The townsfolk, initially skeptical, began to understand that this was not just a marriage of convenience. It was the union of two resilient souls who had chosen each other against all odds. Life after the wedding was a blend of routine and unexpected adventure. Clara continued to work alongside James, learning the ways of the ranch while bringing her own ideas and innovations. James, in turn, found himself softened in ways he hadn't anticipated, allowing humor, tenderness, and occasional vulnerability to seep into his stoic exterior. Yet the past was never far behind. Debts, threats, and the harsh realities of frontier life ensured that peace was always tentative. But together, Clara and James faced these challenges. Their partnership now formalized, their connection unbreakable. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Clara leaned against James, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "You know," she whispered, "I don't think I could have made it without you." James chuckled softly, eyes on the horizon. "And I wouldn't have wanted to do it without you." The Wild West was unforgiving, full of danger and uncertainty. But in the Harland Ranch, there was a sense of home, of belonging, and of love that neither time nor circumstance could erase. And as the stars began to twinkle over Red Creek, both Clara and James knew that the greatest adventure wasn't just surviving, it was choosing each other every single day,